Hello, I'm David McArthur. I'm Senior Lecturer in Transport Studies at the University of Glasgow and Associate Director of the Urban Big Data Centre. Very pleased to be able to join you virtually today. I'm going to be talking about how we might use digital footprint data to promote active travel, particularly in our cities. Why might we want to do this, you ask? Well, I'm talking to you from Glasgow today, where the COP26 conference is still ongoing as I talk. It's nearing the end, and we're still trying to figure out how are we going to cut greenhouse gas emissions to limit global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. As many of you are probably aware, the transport sector plays a big role here. So around 23%, so nearly a quarter of the energy-related CO2 emissions are coming from the transport sector. A lot of this is caused by road traffic, so a lot of the growth we've had over the past years has been caused by an increase in people travelling on the roads. We're expecting to see an increase in the global car fleet, so tripling by 2050, according to some UN estimates. Many of these still running on fossil fuels, so this is not a good news story for this sector. As we see the climate emergency advance and as we see some of the effects of climate change start to have an impact, many cities are now looking at ways in which they can improve their transport sector, and part of that's about cutting the greenhouse gas emissions. It seems to me, at least, that one way or another this is going to mean we have fewer cars in our cities. There is still some debate about this, but it seems to me this is where we have to go, one way or the other. A reason I'm a bit hesitant to say fewer cars is in recent years, or certainly in the past couple of years, there's been quite a bit of attention being paid to the idea that we can change our current fossil fuel powered car fleet over to electric vehicles. This isn't a bad idea. We should try to move from fossil fuel cars over to electric vehicles, but it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve all of the problems. So yes, great to promote electric vehicles, but I think there's a few problems here. Part of this is that we miss some important opportunities to improve our cities. And part of it's more practical. We have to produce these electric vehicles, which has a climate impact. We have to put in the infrastructure from them. And while we're still powering our cities and our countries by burning fossil fuels, we're not necessarily going to have the sort of impact on greenhouse gas emissions that we need to see. So until the electricity network is decarbonised, this isn't going to help decarbonise transport. And there are some problems that I like to mention. I like to rain on the parade of the electric vehicles. So we're still seeing around 1.3 million people die globally on the roads each year. Replacing fossil fuel vehicles with electric vehicles, I'm not sure how this is going to help that problem. And it's also worth pointing out that while we may not have greenhouse gas emissions from electric vehicles, there are still air quality problems generated by them. So they're very heavy and the wheels on the road throw up all sorts of dust. So there's some studies showing that the particulates thrown into the air by these cars are comparable to fossil fuel vehicles. So not great for our health and air qualities in cities. We also need a lot more infrastructure, so we need all the charging infrastructure to go in, and the electric vehicles still take up place in our cities. So I'm talking to you from Glasgow. In Glasgow, about 25% of the land area of the city is roads. So that's not necessarily the sort of city that people want to live in, or the sort of city that promotes mental and physical health. So in some ways, future mobility might be nice, shiny electric vehicles, maybe even autonomous vehicles in the years to come. But I think part of future mobility has to look to the past and has to be about more walking and more cycling. Around the COP conference in Glasgow, there's a lot of pictures and protests being put up saying that this machine fights climate change, with a picture of a bicycle. So yes, if we can move some of the road-based traffic and think about alternative modes, walking, cycling, wheeling, that could go some way to cutting emissions, CO2 emissions, but also just making the city better and improving health. So there's some big gains we could have here if we manage this transition in the proper way. In Scotland in particular, many of the road trips in cars and buses are pretty short, so about half of them are under 5.5 kilometres. That's also the average length of a cycle trip in Scotland. So we might think that quite a lot of these local trips, short trips, could potentially move over to active travel, and potentially quite big gains with that. So I'm going to talk about some examples of what's going on in Glasgow to try to promote a transition to active travel. There's some quite interesting things going on, and I'm based in Glasgow and COP is in Glasgow, so it seems as good a reason as any to talk about what's happening here. So for those of you who don't know, Glasgow is one of the UK's largest cities. It's the largest city in Scotland, population just over 630,000. So not so big compared to some cities, but one of the larger ones in the UK. It's an interesting city, so there are some very wealthy areas of the city, but also some of the poorest and most deprived communities in the UK. In part, that has led to low car ownership rates amongst the population, so around 50%. That's quite a good place to start with in terms of moving to fewer cars. But we do still have problems with congestion and air quality and so on, with people driving into the city and through the city and so on. The city has an extensive urban rail network, and it has the world's third oldest subway system. So there's some quite good things to build on here. The city, though, traditionally has been quite car dominated. For any of you who visited it, you might know there's a very large motorway that runs right through the centre of the city, cutting the city into different parts. And it feels like a city that's designed for cars. As part of this, in recent years, they have put together a budget from the Glasgow City Region deal and have set aside £115 million to try to do something about this. So the local name for the project is called the Avenues Project. It has a much longer name, but we tend to just call it the Avenues Project. And the idea of this project is to try to take some of the city's main streets, so 17 of the key streets, and to move them away from being centred around vehicles and move them towards being centred around people. So in part, this means reallocating the space. So going from several lanes for cars down to 2, and then having more space on the pavements, either for things like dining or leisure, for sitting around, for walking, and also having proper segregated cycling infrastructure available. At the same time, introducing things like rain gardens, better lighting, and so on, which is quite interesting. Things like rain gardens are helping to mitigate against some of the negative effects of climate change. So seeing an increase in rain, seeing an increase in the amount of flooding, we need to think about how we manage these things. So this kind of green and blue infrastructure being put in can help with that. So it's a small map here of the city centre. I just want to give you some idea of the extent of what this project looks like. So this is the key city centre area of Glasgow that we're looking at, and you can see here that there are several different roads or avenues that are going to be created, and then they connect to form a network allowing you to go from north to south or east to west in the city. Since these have been announced, the project's been tacked on to some other projects, and it's going to be connected more to the north, south, east and west. So it's trying to build active travel networks to allow people to move around the city. So it will be interesting to see how this program works as it's rolled out. So just to give you more of a concrete example of what I'm talking about, you can see here one of the streets in the city centre of Glasgow, taken when it was quite quiet and on a day when the sun was shining, which it doesn't always do. So you can see here we have several lanes of traffic, we have parking by the side of the street, and we have some relatively small pavements on either side. So definitely a street that's designed to move vehicles from one end to the other rather than about moving people. This is the artist's impression of what it's supposed to look like. So we can see there's now 2 lanes for traffic so that they can move in each direction. We can see segregated cycle lane, and we can see much more space on the pavements. There's some people sitting out there drinking. You can see extra trees have been added into it, and these rain gardens that I mentioned earlier. So trying to make it a much nicer place for people. As another example, you can see here the motorway that cuts through Glasgow. So this is some of the access routes onto the motorway, but this is also where pedestrians are expected to walk if they want to move between different parts of the city. So the idea is to take an environment like this. We haven't gotten around to removing the motorway yet, although that's a discussion, but at least doing something like this where the cars are a bit less prominent and there's a bit more space for walking and cycling to happen. So this is nice. This is something that the city's planning to do. They have done one pilot street so far. Unfortunately, there's been quite a bit of delay that has happened, partly because of the COP26 conference. It was delayed, and then the pandemic, and then COP was delayed. So it's had some knock-on impacts. But we're now hoping that next year they're going to pick up the program again and start with the next phases of it. There's a lot of money invested in this, and as you can probably guess, people who are using cars to access the city aren't necessarily happy that the amount of space for cars is going to be reduced. In practice, this also means there has to be fewer cars. If you think of the example we've just seen where we have 5 lanes of traffic, if you're going to go from 5 down to 2, you're not going to be able to fit as many cars there. You're not going to have the same parking, the same throughput of vehicles, so there's going to have to be fewer vehicles. So this sort of thing isn't necessarily popular. This really makes it important, I think, that we are able to demonstrate the value of doing this, that we're able to show that if you make these kinds of changes, that there are positive impacts, that we see more cycling, that we see more pedestrians, that perhaps the street moves more people when it's used for active travel than it does when there are vehicles. So it's very important to be able to do this, to be able to do the evaluation, and to make this positive case for this kind of change. Similarly, if it doesn't work and it wasn't a good idea, then we want to try to see that that's the case and to try and understand why, what might need to be done differently. Whatever the case, though, we need some data to try and understand this. I'm based in a data center, so we're always interested in what data might be available and how that might help us. So, unfortunately, active travel data is sometimes a bit lacking, especially in the UK. We don't have so many sources of it. We have things like surveys, of course, household surveys, travel diaries. That's a bit problematic. People tend to forget to report these sorts of short trips and so on anyway, even if you ask them. But they also lack detail. We don't necessarily know which streets they took and so on. So if we want to understand something like walking, it's not so easy to do. The household surveys also tend not to capture many cycling trips. Cycling not very popular in Scotland at the moment, although the rate at which people cycle is increasing. We're seeing it have a larger mode share. But at the stage we're at the moment, it's quite small. So if you do a representative household survey, you probably won't capture that many cyclists. So what else can we do? Well, one traditional thing to do is to install a counter, so an induction loop or something, put it under the road, and then count how many cyclists go over it. Or something for pedestrian, we could have a Bluetooth counter or something with beams, whatever it might be, to try and count the people that are using it. This is good. It does give a somewhat limited view of what's going on though. So firstly, we need to put the counters in. They're quite expensive. They need to be maintained. So we have quite a bad record in Glasgow of putting these counters in and then they break down. No one fixes them and then we don't have any data from them. They're also limited in what they tell us. So they will tell us how many people are passing a particular point. They're not telling us where the people are coming from or going to. And it's quite a sparse representation of what's going on in the network. We also have some manual counts that take place in Glasgow a couple of days out of every year, so that's another option that we can think about using. We're interested in the centre about, are there some other sources of data that we can use? And of course there are, and there are increasingly more and more options that we can think about to understand what's happening in our cities. One of these sources of data is crowdsourced data, where you get the citizens, one way or the other, to tell you what's happening. So a lot of quite nice examples of this. One of the things that we've been particularly interested in is the Strava app. So this is an app used globally by cyclists, also by some runners and walkers. You can track various sports on it, but it's a smartphone app. You open it up when you're going to do an activity, mostly cycling. You tap when you start the activity. It tracks you using the GPS and other location data, and then it maps what route did you take, what speed did you travel, what was your elevation, and so on. And this gives quite valuable information about what's happening in a city. So it tells us what roads are popular, it tells us where cyclists come from, where do they go to, how long do they wait at different parts of the city, and so on. So here's a little map just showing how busy the streets are in Glasgow. So the thicker the line, the more cycling traffic that's there. So immediately when you plot something like this, you can start to get an idea of what are the roads that are popular in Glasgow with cyclists and what are the roads that are not popular. You can see here on the north bank of the river that runs through the city, the River Clyde, you can see the lines quite thick. So lots of cyclists using that as their route. And that's a cycle highway that goes through Glasgow. It's separated from traffic, so it's a popular choice. There are other roads there we can also see are quite thick, so they're also heavily trafficked, and some that are not. So we might wonder what is it that makes a good route? Where are the cyclists? Where are the cyclists not going? And what can we do about that? There are all sorts of potential pitfalls using crowdsourced data, so we might wonder whether this is really representative. If we look demographically, it's not representative. So for the Strava cycling app, it's mostly used by men. We would expect that, at least in the UK, men dominate when it comes to cycling. It's mostly men who are cycling. But even if you account for that, there's still a disproportionate number of men using the Strava cycling app. So we have to be a bit careful when we interpret the data that we don't end up making the policy for the people who are represented in the data set and then excluding others from that. We have done some validation work though, and others have also done similar. So we've plotted here some of the counts that you derive from the Strava data, and then some of the counts that are captured from more traditional sensor technologies. And I've just plotted them for a few locations around the city here. So you can see there is, of course, some variation. They don't agree exactly. If you look at the axes, you'll see that so the vertical axis here is showing the reading we get from the counter, so that should be every cyclist that passes, and you'll see that's much higher than what the Strava count is. So only a quite small percentage of the total number of cyclists are using this app, but still it is able to capture something about where is busy and where is not busy. It captures some of this spatial differences in the distribution of where cycling activity is happening, even though not perfectly. So we certainly don't have a perfect fit on the regression lines here, but definitely statistically significant and definitely able to differentiate between where is busy and when is it busy. So there's other studies from around the world showing similar quite high levels of correlation when we're trying to see what's happening at different locations. So good for helping us track what's happening over time and for differences in activity levels between different locations. So we've used this kind of data for various purposes. One of the things we're most interested in is to try and document what happens with infrastructure. So Glasgow over recent years has tried to put in infrastructure. This has been a bit of a mix. So some of this has been doing something like installing a bus lane but allowing cyclists to use it. Maybe just painting something on a road saying cyclists can use it, all the way up to fully segregated infrastructure with two-way traffic for the cyclists. So a real variation in terms of the quality. And what we used this data to show in one of our papers was that on the good quality segregated infrastructure, you see quite a large uplift in the volume of cycling activity, whereas on the less or the lower quality infrastructure, not really much impact on cycling numbers. So it's nice to be able to demonstrate this. So we saw cycling by volumes up by almost 18%. On some of the high quality infrastructure, on others it was much lower or no difference at all. So useful to be able to see what works, what doesn't work, and to be able to demonstrate that something has worked and to make the case for doing more of that sort of thing. We had another paper where we tried to have a more exploratory approach. So the map that I'm showing here It tries to look at where are cyclists attracted to and where are they repelled by. What we did with this was looking at the origin-destination flows of the trips by the cyclists. We looked if they'd taken the quickest route, where would you expect to see them on the network, and we compared that to where you did actually see them on the network. So the black lines here are showing areas the cyclists like to avoid. They didn't cycle there as much as you would expect. The red lines are showing areas that they were attracted to. The thicker the line, the greater the attraction. It's quite an interesting representation because some roads that may have many cyclists aren't necessarily that popular. So given their location in the network and what they connect and the demand for travel, you should expect them to be even busier. So you can see along the north bank of the river, we saw that was busy, and indeed it is because people like to go there. But if you look one block north, you can see there's a road there that people avoid. So if people wanted to get to their journey quicker, they could take this route, but they avoid it, probably preferring the better infrastructure, perhaps also preferring being closer to green space or blue space. So this gives us quite a nice understanding of what's going on in the city and where cyclists like to be, where they don't like to be, and that might help us design better infrastructure for cyclists. So, as I mentioned, cycling is good. It allows us to reach destinations which are a bit further away than walking, opens up all sorts of possibility. At the moment, though, in some countries, and certainly in the UK, it's a bit of a niche activity. So something like 1.5% of people cycling to work, maybe a little bit higher now. We'll have to see when we get the latest data, but still somewhat of a minority activity. So we should definitely be working to increase this. We're seeing the number rise. We're seeing more cycling activity. The pandemic, to some extent, has increased that as people shy away from public transport. It will be interesting to see how much of that increase persists. At the same time, though, pedestrian travel is much more common. Pretty much everyone walks or wheels at some point. Even if you take public transport, that will usually involve a walking or wheeling element to access the public transport. So we want to try and make cities that promote walking and that make walking safe and make walking a natural choice for everyday journeys. Much more accessible. You don't need the equipment of a bicycle. You don't need somewhere to store it. You just need your 2 feet or your mobility aid, and then you can move around the city. This is something we have really poor data on, though. Walking is just expected to happen. It's usually a bit of an afterthought how pedestrians are going to navigate a space, and it's just left to happen, and often people don't really think to document where is it happening, when, and how much. So there are some pedestrian counters in the city. They tend to be attached to cycle counters, again, somewhat as an afterthought. And then we do also have some manual counts, so we have a 2-day cycle count every year, and that also counts pedestrians. So that is useful, but there's only some of these, and they're not always well maintained. So we were trying to think about other ways you can capture data. Because walking isn't very exciting necessarily, people don't really think to capture their utility walk. So if you walk to your local shop, you're probably not going to get an app out to track that walk. Or if you walk to work, again, you're probably not going to bother tracking that on an app. So crowdsourced options could be possible, but I don't think there's any readily available source. So one idea we came up with was, what about the CCTV cameras that we have all over our city? So we see a picture of one of these here. These are effectively sensors. We have these all over the city, taking pictures of our streets. And we thought, well, is this something we could be using to count pedestrians? So in the UK in particular, it's I think we have some of the highest numbers of CCTV cameras per person in the world. But most of these are sitting idle for most of the time. They're not being used for anything. They're there, they're capturing footage, probably no one's looking at them. So we worked with the local council. We went to them and asked them, can we do a project with you where you give us some of the cameras or give us the footage from some of the cameras, and we will use machine vision AI to try and do automated counts of pedestrians. So they were happy to work with us on this. So we've devised a system now where we can program any of the cameras in the city to turn to a fixed position on a regular basis. So we're doing 30 minutes at the moment. So every half hour, the cameras on our system swing around to a particular position. They snap a photograph. The machine then looks at it, counts the number of objects. We're most interested in pedestrians, but we also count vehicles. And then it writes down how many pedestrians and how many vehicles were in the scene that it captured. The nice thing about this is it's all done in a secure environment. So it sits, we have a machine that sits in the CCTV suite that's run by the local government. It captures this image, does the counting, and then the image is destroyed, and what we retain is the count. So we don't have to work with personal data. We don't have to reveal any sensitive data. So it's a nice way to do it. So if I give you an example, this is one of the cameras we've had running the longest. So I've plotted here the relative activity measure since we switched it on in late 2019 and up to quite recently. So you can see we had the idea that we would do these on these avenues in Glasgow, and we would try and capture the activity level before and then the activity level after they'd done the upgrade. We didn't have much before, but by the time we got the project up and running, but the pandemic turned out to be one of the more interesting things that we captured. So you can see here when the UK went into a national lockdown in March 2020, you can see there's a massive drop in activity. We then capture some of the increase in activity as some restrictions were eased, and then we had some more lockdowns, especially in Glasgow. So we see activity levels dropped again, and they're now starting to recover and starting to look a bit more like they were pre-pandemic. On the next plot here, I've added in data from a company called Springboard. So they do more traditional pedestrian counts. I believe this is based on counting the number of Bluetooth devices that pass by. So this is more traditional way of counting the data. You can see here it matches our own CCTV camera data pretty well. They pick out the same trends in what's going on, but the benefit is we have CCTV cameras all over the city. So we now have this sort of situation, a dashboard of cameras around the city where we can track the relative activity. We can see what areas are busy, what areas are not busy, what are the trends. And if we have any interventions to promote walking or cycling in these areas, we can have something to measure the impact. So really valuable data that we just didn't have before. We just didn't know what was happening with the activity levels with respect to walking. Some of the most interesting ones recently, I have a selection of the cameras from along the River Clyde here, particularly the one in the bottom right. You can see a massive increase in activity. This is right next to where the COP26 meeting's taking place. So you can see the system picks up that this area has become much busier. So what we hope now that we're capturing all this data is that as the Avenues program's rolled out, we'll have some nice before and after data, and we'll be able to track what happens as we make these interventions in the network. So this should be really valuable data. Local governments already found it pretty valuable to help with planning, to help with managing the pandemic restrictions, and as we come out of the pandemic, helping to monitor what's happening. So in terms of the climate emergency, there's a lot of work to be done in the transport sector and not much time to do it. So I think, and I hope I've made the case that active travel is going to be an important part of this. We can't rely on replacing one type of car with another type of car. We have to think about how to have fewer cars, fewer car trips, more walking, more cycling, better health, better air quality, and so on. We can think about new forms of data and how they can help. So some of these sensor networks are already in place. We have smartphones. We can collect data from them in a variety of ways. We have these CCTV camera networks. We used open source off-the-shelf software to power this system. So it's something that other places could roll out, and they could also be collecting this type of data. So another way to think about it is we also need to try and get local government to value this data, to think of it as a strategic asset, to open it up where possible if it's not sensitive, so that we can try and come up with innovative solutions. We can try and promote active travel, try and make the urban transport network more sustainable and better for everyone. So thank you for your attention. I hope that's been interesting or informative. As I'm not here live, I can't take any questions at the moment, but I'm very happy if you want to email, get in touch. I'm also on Twitter if you like to use that, and happy to hear from you or to discuss any further research. So thank you again.